As an architect and painter, I will explore Lange's thinking from the angle of figures at the edge of an unfolding momentum. The impulse for this presentation emerges from Susanne Lange's understanding of the work of art as more than an arrangement of given things, but rather as something that emerges from tones, colors, intervals, and tensions. Artistic form gives rise to something not previously present. Relations, rhythms, atmospheres, and orientational fields unfold that exceed the mere sum of their elements. Lange describes this creation of the primary illusion as the elementary function shared by all plastic arts, while insisting equally on the decisive differences between artistic forms. So, how do architecture and painting begin to operate not merely as objects or closed entities, but as orientational and atmospheric fields? This contribution traces the emergence of such virtual places at the edge, beginning with the appearance of what I call element acts, in resonance with Lange. The horizon appears as a slight deviation between sea and sky. A white sail displaced from ship and sea, a cylindrical structure resembling a tower, elongated shadows, an arcade, a cave, a wall. They emerge as local intensities before entering relations. The element acts emerge simultaneously as preparation and presence. Elements in art do not possess the character of things, but of acts. They remain active, operative, act-like. Things are crafts through action itself. Artists work with actual form in order to produce perception. The emotive import belongs to the living form itself, rather to what it represents or suggests. Isolation becomes the simplest means of breaking with representation, disrupting narration, escaping illustration, and deliberating the figure in order to remain close to the fact, to the actual. The immediate can be translated more directly than they already mediated. The contribution therefore begins with the elements themselves before discourse stabilizes them. The element acts possess expressive rather than representational force. Representation emerges only afterwards. A work of art carries its significance before the subject can even be identified. The immediate can be translated more directly than the already mediated. Similar to the concepts of the figural in Cézanne, Deleuze, and Lyotard, the element acts are extracted from their figurative and narrative links. The clinament produces turbulence. A gust of wind causes a minimal deviation, a local imbalance. Relation emerges through slight displacement, through kinship and similarity rather than identity. Two element acts are therefore selected. The horizon and the wall bear a slight resemblance to one another. Touch tangentially, condition one another, yet remain incommensurable. The curve and its tangent produce the smallest possible angle, distanced elements like a square tower approach. Differential geometry becomes a phenomenology of the chaos, where relation emerges through touch rather than identity. Understanding no longer arises through detached distance, but through tactile approximation and the following of curvatures. Analogously, navigation never proceeds along a perfectly stable trajectory. A ship remains on course only through continual micro corrections within currents, turbulence, and drift. Painting and architecture unfold as distinct manifestations of spatial conception whose differences remain as significant as the similarities. The general characters do not become identified. Lange speaks of an internal similarity between the things. Yet this innermost relation can only express itself through analogies. There remains within translation a core that itself is untranslatable and that exceeds communication. Tangential movement is taken as the logic of translation. The translation between painting and architecture seeks to reveal the relation in a germinal and intensive manner. Translation can become more than mediation. It serves the afterlife and renewed unfolding of works through transformation. It does not seek to communicate their content, but rather to transfer the manner of meaning. If meaning lies deeply embedded within the work, translation can touch it only fleetingly, at the point where the tangent touches the circle. Fidelity becomes contact, while freedom becomes the free movement of the work of art itself. Translation becomes passage across shifting currents and relational fields. Already the literal sense of Übersetzung implies drift, deviation, and continual adjustment. Rather than reproducing an identical trajectory, poetic translation proceeds tangentially, remaining close to the original while continuously altering its course in response to local tonalities, rhythms, and semantic intensities. Meaning emerges through tangential proximity rather than strict equivalence. Minimal deviation becomes the very condition of formation itself. Order emerges from infinitesimal variations within moving currents. It proceeds from the assumption that knowledge emerges not through distance but through tangential participation. How does orientation emerge? Through local operative relations. The element acts become orientational only through triangulated relation. Individually, horizon and wall remain isolated intensities. Only through their relational alignment does a field begin to emerge. The amer in nautical navigation designates a visible and marked point of orientation, a lighthouse, a cliff, a coastal edge. Yet an amer never functions in isolation. It operates only through the relation of several points to one another. It is therefore not a point that fixes a place absolutely, but one that renders a place navigable. Orientation emerges relationally and locally. The medieval Portolan chart can be understood as a model of such tangential rationality. Space is not constructed through abstract coordinates or homogeneous geometry, but through winds, crossings, and experiences, the sound of sirens. Orientation emerges not through the detached overview of a stable totality, but through continual adjustment within a moving field. At this point, a third element enters into relation. The sail activates a constellation. It introduces wind, direction, drift, and time. Through the sail, the previous tension between horizon and wall becomes navigational. Concepts cease to function as fixed coordinates. They become sails exposed to invisible winds, requiring continual adjustment rather than stable positioning. The art is not in setting concept, but in the relative positioning within moving currents and tensions. Vertical lines begin to emerge between the acts. The field becomes directional without ever becoming fixed. Thought itself unfolds as a system of currents and cascades, descending from music toward language, matter, and information. Orientation emerges through intervals, tensions, and continual modulation. The task of thought no longer lies in mastering what has already been established, but in daring its continuation. Composition unfolds through repetition and variation. Rhythm emerges through recurring tensions, and form begins to appear from modulation itself. A work of art becomes more than an arrangement. A symbol of sentence emerges. Composition is not resolution, but selection. It remains fundamentally non-final. Although composition is a pictorial term, it is repeatedly employed within architecture when it is about proportioning rather than merely assembling objects. Deleuze claims that certain paintings tend to generalize a kind of imbalance of things falling and collapsing. Composition sustains relations through imbalance. In this light, still lifes appear as a precarious constellation permanently threatened by disintegration in time. The individual parts render visible the forces and internal tensions acting between them. Transferred to the logic of the Portolan chart, composition becomes a condition of continual local course correction. The work remains in movement. At this stage, the element acts begin to modulate into motivic families. The families do not form stable categories, rather they operate as an overlapping field of relational tendencies. Composition therefore no longer organizes isolated acts, but interferences among motivic families. The wall family operates through framing, delay, threshold, and suspension. It unfolds into arcade, edge, opening, and frame. The gaze is delayed rather than directed. The horizon family operates through orientation, distance, stratification, and continuity. It unfolds into stairs, coastline, terrace, and shadow. The bodily presence of the viewer activates the converging architecture. The stairs recede into the background and turn nature into spectacle. The building's shadow stretches towards the hidden horizon. The sail family operates through tension, drift, orientation, folding, and exposure. It unfolds into wave, canopy, wind, and wheel. The sail is not treated as object, but as a tension-bearing surface. The sea was indistinguishable from the sky, except that the sea was slightly creased, as if a cloth had wrinkles in it. The motivic families remain unstable and begin to overlap. The stairs belong simultaneously to horizon and sail. The wheel oscillates between sail and wall. Composition therefore modulates interference, drift, and resonance. The motif possesses an operative quality within composition. It motivates the work of art. Composition organizes motivic forces rather than stable objects. The motif becomes a recurring spatial impulse, capable of variation, modulation, transformation across painting and architecture. Motifs are repeatedly discovered almost intuitively in the arts, yet often without an attempt to grasp them mathematically through harmonic analysis. Architecture may be understood as a harmonic integration of tensions, intervals, and directional forces. Motifs operate transversely. They function like the wind itself, not as fixed forms, but as driving forces. Horizon, wall, and sail no longer remain isolated element acts. They become operative vectors capable of generating multiple atmospheres. Langer notes how good architecture is kept able to transform through changing light, where every change yields a complete perceptible mood. The building has the capacity to collect images and shift meaning, thus establishing an unstable network of affinities and differentiation. Architecture begins to operate spectrally, less as fixed object than as atmospheric relation. Rhythm itself becomes figure rather than property of an object. Composition is the modulation of rhythms and tensions. Gradually, a virtual place begins to emerge. The building and the painting appear not as isolated objects of analysis, but as atmospheric condensations of motivic relations. A distant coastal profile slowly forms itself out of shadows, winged walls, and horizon lines. The wall condenses into the figure of enigma. One cannot find the entrance to this house. It is hidden like the tombs at the far end, a singular door beckons. The wall frames conceals, interrupts, and delays. Enigma emerges less through secrecy itself than through partial visibility. Casa Malaparte oscillates between a cave-like megaron recalling Greek culture and a labyrinthine sequence of rooms and dead-end corridors. Painting becomes the actualization of an encounter. De Chirico's architectural spaces remain simultaneously familiar and uncanny. Enigma names something real, something that resists explanation. Yet the enigma does not exist as hidden content behind the work, but within the operation itself. The space appears carefully ordered while waiting for something that never fully arrives. The space sustains a condition of expectation composure. Arrival is indefinitely postponed. The horizon condenses into the figure of desire. The final room containing on axis a window overlooking the horizon line, an inaccessible horizon line, the membrane where sky and sea meet. The horizon promises, postpones arrival, and keeps distance open. Desire emerges through the tension toward the far away. The terrace evokes a sacrificial site. Architecture allows vanished bodies to reappear in stone, a disappearance of the body into architectural form. The house oscillates between warmth and opening towards the world. The dwelling days of the absence of the gods, Splendid writes. A continuous oscillation therefore emerges between presence and absence. The visible becomes the stage of an event. Architecture becomes witness to a disappearance and after image. In the words of Aldo Rossi, architecture becomes the vehicle for an event we desire. The incompleteness of form therefore generates a space of waiting. The motivic family of the sail condenses into the figure of the ship. Langer evokes the image of seafaring, of a nomadic culture forming places through ships constantly in motion. A ship constantly changing its location is none the less a self-contained place. Langer writes that architecture has its own center and periphery, not by dividing space externally, but by limiting it from within. The facade becomes a skin, a contact zone. In The Enigma of an Arrival, the sea remains present even when invisible. Hayduk evokes the image of a stationary ship, which draws to its silent presence. Edges, irregularities, and distortions transform the building. Architecture and environment remain in reciprocal formation. Casa Malaparte distills ancient maritime memories. The ship always carries within itself the possibility of disorientation and failure. Yet this instability also becomes the condition of movement itself. Benjamin returns once more to the image of the sail, in which the art of setting the sail is what gives meaning. Concept becomes orientational surfaces exposed to invisible currents. Desire draws toward distance and opens the horizon. Enigma frames and withdraws. The ship moves between them. Casa Malaparte and the enigma of an arrival emerge at edges. Between sea and sky, architecture and landscape, discourse and figure, orientation and disorientation. The edge does not designate a stable boundary, but a threshold of becoming, a zone in which form has not yet fully stabilized and nevertheless already begins to act. A place is constituted by its escate, its outermost limits. The work of art does not reside primarily in its material, but in the form of its edges, the condition of being at the shore. Place is understood topologically. Virtual place does not designate a fixed site, but an orientational and atmospheric condensation within virtual space. The owner of the house, Curzio Malaparte, replied to the question if he had designed the house, "No, but I designed the scenery." This resonates with Heidegger's thinking about the work of art that its own repose brings out the raging of the sea. An inversion occurs. Architecture frames and exposes, while the horizon becomes the frame for architecture itself. Virtual space becomes a bodily place of thought. Casa Malaparte, a resonating body within which these movements of thought can condense. Architecture and painting operate within a virtual place where thought has not yet become fully conceptualized but already becomes perceptible. Thought appears before assuming the objective form of a work as an eye at the edge of discourse, where language unfolds simultaneously as discourse and figure. Thought appears not as completed concept but as a sensitive and spatial movement of emergence. The edge becomes the site of the operative formation itself, the zone where figures begin to emerge from tensions, rhythms and deviations. Casa Malaparte and the enigma of an arrival touch one another fleetingly at the shore before drifting apart again along their untranslatable trajectories. Element acts are to figures what figures are to discourse. Local operative intensities condense into atmospheric constellation in which the eye at the edge of discourse becomes a figure itself. A condensation of tensions, rhythms, and relations that precedes stabilization within representation and language. The movement from local intensity toward atmospheric condensation can be understood through 5 operative topologies. These operations do not replace one another. Each remains embedded within the text. Element acts appear, deviate, triangulate, modulate, and condense into figures within virtual place. A picture must be schematized in order to accommodate multiple meanings. Every drawing presents a singular triangle, yet geometry preserves triangularity itself. The image therefore oscillates between singularity and generality. Relational structures persist across transformation. Mathematics thereby retains generalized forms of livingness and condenses ontological experiences into relational structures. A place emerges through acts of orientation. However, it is a place without fixed location. It emerges relational through interaction, modulation, and tangential proximity. Perception itself unfolds structurally and topologically rather than subjectivistically. Architecture and painting cease to function merely as subjects or objects of representation. They begin to operate instrumentally, as orientational constellations that accommodate the fields of tensions between sea, wind, light, wall, and horizon. Here are my referential dots, and thanks for your attention.